So for sorry, for Zoom, you're using like not the free version, right?
Right. It's a subscription by MSU. So it's
Okay, yeah, because the free version allows only 45 minutes or so.
Yeah, this is unlimited.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So the recording is on. Just let you know. So yeah. And we'll just go ahead and get started. Is it okay with you?
Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Okay,
Yes.
great. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
So, our guest speaker today is Dr. Khaled Barkaoui from York University. So Dr. Barkaoui, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to the guest speaker of our last testing and tasting event in the spring. So I'm gonna briefly introduce you to the audience, all right? Okay. So Dr. Barkaoui is currently an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York University. He obtained his master's degree in linguistics from the University of Manouba, Tunisia, and a PhD in second language education from OISE of the University of Toronto. Dr. Barkaoui has authored several articles and presented numerous national and international conference papers about second language assessment and writing. He's a member of the editorial board for Language Assessment Quarterly. In 2012, he received the TOEFL Outstanding Young Scholar Award. His research interests include, but are not confined to, assessment in education, second language assessment, longitudinal research, and mixed methods research. So thank you very much for your great work, because you have no idea how much you helped me with my second qualifying paper. So today, Dr. Barkaoui will talk about something that I believe all language testers are interested in, the performance of test repeaters. So his talk is entitled Examining the Performance of L2 Test Repeaters, Validity Questions, and Methodological Challenges. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Khaled Barkaoui. Right?
Thank you. Thank you first for inviting me to give a talk and to your group. And the second thing is, this is the first time I do a presentation online, like through Zoom. So so bear with me in terms of if things are not clear. I mean, it's certainly. I think it's going to be different from if it's like if I was there. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. When I got your email and you mentioned that you're interested in research on test repeaters, so that's the reason for selecting this topic. But for me, actually, as you mentioned, I'm interested in research, longitudinal research. There's a new area that I'm interested in, and perhaps this kind of research on test repeaters falls within that that kind of interest, or that area of interest. So I'm going to talk about test repeaters, but most of the things I'm going to talk about actually are related to longitudinal research, and particularly in second language. So that's the area of overlap. I sort of prepared an outline of what I'm going to talk about. Can you all hear me fine?
Yes.
Okay. So the presentation is organized in a way that that first I'm going to talk about this area, as I said, as researching second language development longitudinally as an area of interface between second language acquisition research and testing research. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the issues and considerations in longitudinal research on second language development. And that would take me to talking about second language repeaters, test repeaters as both an example of longitudinal research as well as a set of a context within which some of the important questions and methodological challenges, I guess, for longitudinal research can be discussed. And then I'm going to talk about a couple of studies I did on test repeaters performance as examples of that, and then we'll end with a discussion of some future directions and some challenges. So that's basically the outline, and then hopefully I will cover that within, I think you said I have 45 minutes, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll try to cover that within those 45 minutes. I know it's a lot, but I will just be focusing on what I think are major or main points under each of these themes. So I guess as I said, I mean, this is a new area of interest for me, looking at the how to research and assess second language development over time. And I see this as an example of, or an instance of the interface between second language acquisition research and testing research or testing of second language. So for SLA, oh, it should be SLA here, not SAL. For SLA research, recently there has been a growing interest in and calls for research on the development of second language proficiency over time, to understand how second language proficiency develops over time, as well as the factors that can shape or influence that second language development. There is also a long tradition of examining the effects of second language instruction, different ways of teaching or different methods of teaching, using second language tests. And you can see that usually in what we call experimental or quasi-experimental studies that involve a pre-test and a post-test. At least some of them include also delayed post-test to examine the effects of a particular way of teaching and particular aspects of language over time. And most of these studies will use second language tests, often used to detect change or development, as well as the effects of second language instruction. And most of these studies will assume that the second language tests are of good quality, so that's the validity question, as well as that they are sensitive to change and instructional effects, that they can actually detect change over time in whatever aspects of second language they're examining, and that they can detect the effects of instruction. Okay, so that's an assumption usually made, but not actually empirically tested. In terms of second language testing, there is a growing actually number of people who repeat second language tests, take them multiple times. And usually they take the test multiple times because the first time or the second time they did not achieve a score that they want to achieve to, for example, to get admission to university. So they retake the test again in hopes that they will improve their scores. There is also a growing use of pre-post test designs to provide validity evidence for second language proficiency tests. And this is the opposite of what SLA researchers do. SLA researchers use tests to find out whether a particular method of teaching is effective or not, makes a difference in terms of learning or not. From a validity point of view, the assumption is that the instruction is effective, and we're using the test using that instruction to find out if scores on the test will change as a result of that instruction. That then we use that as evidence to claim that the test provides valid inferences. And so that's the way it is used in some studies like Ling et al. And Olaf and Akudis, who administered the TOEFL in the first, in the case of Ling, and IELTS and the other study, before and after a period of instruction of second language instruction. And then the claim they make is that because there was a difference in scores, then that lends support to the validity of the test. There is also, I think, a growing interest in using second language proficiency tests to measure second language development over time and instructional effects. And you can see this in some studies that are published, which say that there is an improvement in the English language proficiency of particular group students in a particular program because the test scores before and after instruction improve. And so although most proficiency tests like IELTS and TOEFL are actually developed and designed to be used to assess proficiency at a particular point in time, there's now a growing use of them to make claims about second language proficiency development, as well as the effectiveness of some instructional programs. And so that's the other area, I guess, of interface between second language testing and SLA research. But in the literature, most of the research on language tests, as well as discussion of research methods, tend to be cross-sectional, focusing on assessment and research of second language proficiency at a particular point in time. And most second language tests are designed to assess second language proficiency at one point in time. And so the analogy I sometimes use is that most of these tests are actually developed to provide us like a still photo, a camera that can take a picture at one point in time. But there are, in some cases, in many cases actually now, are used to develop a movie, meaning to provide a picture of second language development over time, and that's something that's not, as I said, it's not empirically examined or supported. So this takes us to the question of researching second language development longitudinally, and the main point I'm trying to make here is that researching and testing second language development over time is a more complex and requires more and different considerations and types of validity evidence than cross-sectional research and testing. And so, this happens at many levels. And so if we want to research or test second language development over time, it's very different from if we're testing or researching second language development, second language proficiency at one point in time. And we need to consider not only the measurement, not only the test, but also the design and the analysis. And so in terms of design, with cross-sectional at one point of time measurement, we only need to think about when to measure our students at a particular point in time. And maybe that's not very important in a cross-section study, but with the longitudinal view of second language development, we need to think carefully about how to design or plan data collection. I'm going to talk about this in a bit. In terms of measurement, there's a question of how we ensure that what we're measuring is actually gets us what we think we're getting, but also measuring second language proficiency over time actually raises other measurement and validity issues, which I'm going to talk about too. And then the last question concerns how to analyze data. So unlike cross-sectional approaches to research and assessment, where we're just doing this at one point in time, and whatever the score we get, we say it reflects the proficiency of the student or group of students at a particular point in time. When we're trying to measure second language development over time, then we need to think about all these things. So I'm going to talk about these three dimensions or aspects of measuring second language development in terms of issues of design, issues of measurement, and issues of analysis. So in terms of issues of design, as I said, there's a distinction between one snapshot versus multiple measurement occasions with longitudinal research. And there are issues that are similar to cross-sectional research, so such as which variables are constructs to include the sampling and so on. But there are some issues that are unique to longitudinal research and assessment of second language development over time. One of them is how to define and measure time. Right, and so time is in the literature defined in different ways. Just to give two very common examples in the literature, time can be measured in terms of age, but time also can be measured in terms of program length and so on. So those are important things that need to be considered. How to define and measure time. There's also the temporal design of longitudinal research, which includes many questions like when do we test or measure the ability? How often do we do that? Once, twice, three times or more? For how long the measurement should be, and how far away from each other the measures are, so the spacing of measurement occasions. All those things need to be considered and determined appropriately depending on many factors, including the aspects of language we're looking at, as well as the stage maybe of development of the learners and so on. And so usually those are determined based on a specific theory, but most of the time we don't have actually very clear or specific theories that can guide these decisions in terms of assessment of second language ability or aspects of language ability over time. The second set of factors concern measurement. And these are usually discussed in terms of validity threats, right? In terms of what kind of threats can be, or issues or challenges can actually undermine the inferences we draw based on measurement of second language development over time. And so there are many such issues. One of them is that the reliability and validity of any measure we use can potentially change over time, even if we're measuring the same individuals using the same measure. There's evidence in other fields, like particularly in the measurement of cognitive development or cognition of older adults, that the reliability and validity of some of the measures will change over time. The other question, which is particularly relevant in the measurement of change, is the reliability of change. And this is about the question of, is the observed change in scores due to true change in the construct being measured, or to changes in the measurement of the construct, to other factors, right? And so if someone gets a higher or a lower score in a second or third time they're taking the test, is that change in score, does that reflect a true change in the construct being measured, or other factors? And so the key thread here is what we call measurement variance, which is the opposite of measurement invariance. And this basically says that the changes in measurement do not reflect the construct, the same construct classifications, because of changes in some aspects of the measurement. So, for example, items or tasks becoming more or less difficult, the administration and the scoring of the assessment change across test occasions, or rater severity or leniency changes across test occasions. The very good examples of that you see in studies of second language development is that different tasks, for example, are used on different test occasions. So the first time the students are given a particular task, and then the second time they're given hopefully an equivalent task, but it is different. And then the question is, a change in performance, is that due to actual change in the proficiency, or is that due to changes in the task themselves? The other issue, which is actually the opposite of what happens with measurement variance, is if we keep the same tasks, for example, and use them on different test occasions, then we may have what we call practice effects. And this is basically saying that the change in the observed score in the case of tests is not due to a change in the ability being measured, but it's due to a change or experience with the measures. Okay, so that's what we call practice effect. Another thread, which is not very often discussed, is what we call lack of sensitivity to change. And this is the opposite, where actually a change, we do not observe a change in scores, right? And the question is that due to that no actual change happened, or is it because the measure we're using lacks sensitivity to change? And in the context of the use of these tests to measure instructional effects or intervention effects, the measure may lack sensitivity to intervention effects, right? So it cannot detect true change. And that's also a threat to validity, in the sense that we end up saying that there is no change when in fact maybe there is. And then the last threat is what we call regression to the mean. And this is basically the possibility that the change in scores an artifact of statistical regression toward the group mean. And this usually happens particularly when we have only two measurement occasions, and there are also other reasons. And then the last aspect of this kind of research that we need to consider is the analysis of the data. So traditional statistical techniques like ANOVA and regression are actually limited in examining change over time. And so we need to use other newer methods to provide a better estimate of change, as well as actually separate true change from measurement error. And so the methods like structural equation modeling and multi-level modeling and linear growth curve modeling, all those are better at modeling change than traditional models. And one thing that we need to to focus on, or the main thing actually we want to focus on with longitudinal research, is we're no longer looking at and comparing data points, but we're actually usually interested in what we call trajectories or data lines. And so to illustrate that, I'm going to use this graph here. So when we're looking at data cross-sectionally, we're looking at data points and comparing them either across individuals or across groups, right? But when we're looking at second language development over time, what we're interested in, what we're comparing is usually a line, a data line, I call it, or a trajectory, where we're looking at whether two or more people have, or groups have, different kinds of trajectories in terms of their development. And that makes the analysis more complex. And so more, as I said, traditional ways of analyzing that data will not usually work effectively. So in order to, as I said, to be able to research and assess second language development, we're moving now from beyond just focusing on the development of the test itself, its sensitivity to differences in proficiency at one point in time, to trying to look at a trajectory and comparing those trajectories and understanding why and how those trajectories are different. And that, as I said, makes it more complex and requires that we look beyond just the question of validity as traditionally examined in relation to tests, which is just how to develop a test and make sure it's sensitive to differences, to actually thinking about the whole design of measuring proficiency at multiple points in times, including questions of when and how to do that, but also how to analyze the data in a way and scores in a way that actually gives us valid inferences about not only describing the rate of change or development, but also trying to explain that change and understand why that happens. So as I said, this is an area that I'm looking at, and wrote a paper on 2014, published in 2014 about the data analysis. And currently we're working on two papers, one about measurement issues and on this, so addressing some of the issues, or all of the issues I talked about. Another one talking about design issues and how that has been approached in research in second language development in the literature. So one of the areas I've been focusing on, and my current and some of the recent research I've done, is test repeaters. Okay, and test repeaters for me, there usually include two groups, I think, or the way I think of them. The first one is test takers who retake second language tests, right? So if they're taking the TOEFL multiple times or IELTS or have you, those we call them test repeaters. But also for me, the word test repeaters or repeaters applies to learners who take a test before and after a period of second language instruction. So studies that have participants who are experience a particular approach, for example, to teaching particular aspects of second language, and where they are assessed before and after instruction, maybe at a delayed later point in time. And so I would think of all of those as repeaters of the same measurement of the construct, maybe not identical in the sense, not the same tasks, but they are still repeating what is assumed to be the same assessment. In both cases, the goal or the assumption is that the change in test scores reflects a real change in the construct being measured. And that's how we make claims, for example, about the effectiveness of particular instruction methods or approach, by saying that we observed change in scores which reflects a change in the construct, and then we attribute that change to the whatever intervention which I guess issues of design and so on. I use the word change because I think it's a neutral word compared, and that change direction can be positive, and that's what we call it, growth, gain, or development, or negative, and can be a decline or loss. So change for me is a more neutral word, so I'd use that more often than the growth or or loss words, or the word gain, which is sometimes used. And then the key question here, whether changes in repeaters' test scores reflect true changes in second language proficiency or are due to other, usually constructive relevant factors. As I said earlier, this is a often assumed but not tested assumption in many of the studies, and also discussions of changes in the scores of repeaters of proficiency tests. So here's some of the validity or threats, validity questions or threats that one can actually look at or ask in terms of test repeaters' performance. And they are organized around three, I think, main inferences in the validity argument that I think are most important to address. And the main one concerns the explanation inference. And this is about the question, do changes in repeaters' test performance reflect true changes in L2 ability or the effects of other constructor relevant factors, right? So if we see a change in someone's score, whether they're repeating a test or taking a test before and after instruction, is that change true change in the construct or due to other factors, right? And traditionally, this question about variability in scores is addressed by examining the main sources of variability in test performance across groups or individuals at one point in time. But we can address this question by looking at variability in test performance across time or test occasions, right? There are other questions that are sub-questions that fall under this major question, including the psychometric properties and factor structure of the test and whether they change across test occasions or not. Whether learners who take or do a test again, for example, change the way they go about doing the test in terms of the strategies and the skills they use and the processes they use, and whether these changes are reflected in their, for example, written or spoken performances, and what factors account for these changes. And then the other question is practice effects, which ask whether does repeating the test, the experience, the fact of repeating the test itself affects subsequent test performance, and to what extent or whether different test takers actually benefit from the experience of rating the test, taking the test differently, or whether different language skills actually benefit from retaking the test in different ways, meaning that some subgroups of test takers may benefit from the experience of retaking the test multiple times more so than other groups. Another question related to the explanation inference, which is also important for SLA research, I think, is the relationship between second language, relationship of repeaters' performance to their second language learning and the instruction they receive. And so questions like how long does it take to observe significant true changes in scores on second language proficiency tests? Or how do changes in repeaters' test performance relate to amount and nature of second language instruction and test preparation received? So those are, I think, important questions for supporting the explanation inference in relation to repeaters' test scores, but also they are relevant and important for understanding second language development and factors affecting it and how instruction shapes that. There's also some validity issues or questions related to generalization inference, and this is mostly about the reliability and whether reliability of tests changed over time or across test occasions. And then the final one concerns the extrapolation inferences, with this, which asks about the relationship between test scores and other criteria or criterion. And the question here is whether the relationship between test scores and relevant criteria, like, for example, GPA in predicting academic performance, or other tests of the same construct change over time and or for retest and initial scores, right? So, for example, is the relationship between initial score that someone takes the test for the first time and their academic performance, is that different from the relationship between their retest score and their academic performance? And if the answer to that is yes, then that raise questions about the the quality of the inferences of that test. So those some of the questions I've identified in relation to the quality of inferences from repeaters' test scores. And some of the research I'm doing is trying to address that. And so some of the studies we have done or we're currently doing actually address those questions. So I'm going to talk about the first two studies on this slide. The first one looked at changes in the linguistic characteristics of IELTS repeaters task 2 essays to see if changes, what kind of changes happen in terms of the characteristics of repeaters' essays over time and how those relate to their scores. And the second one looked at the sources of variability in the Pearson test of English academic repeaters' writing scores over time. We just finished the study, which is under review now, which looked at changes in learners' responses to TOEFL IBT independent and integrated writing tasks after a period of, I think, 9 months of second language instruction. So those are the students took the TOEFL before and after 9 months of English language instruction, and we're trying to, in that study, we looked at the changes in the characteristics of their, or the writing features of their essays. And one which I think we're going to finish in a couple of weeks, or submit the report in a couple of weeks, we looked at the changes in second language learners' progress scores and written responses in relation to second language instruction. Progress is a test developed by Pearson and to my knowledge is the only test currently that aims to assess second language development over time. And it's in this study, the test was administered to students at the beginning of a second language course, in the middle, and at the end. So we have 3 data points, and we're looking at changes in the written responses. So by analyzing the essays the students wrote, as well as changes in their scores. Okay. So I call this kind of a longitudinal validation research, looking at the validity of inferences based on repeater scores over time. And we're using a kind of a framework or model, I guess, to look at this. And basically, as you can see in this graph here, we're saying that differences and changes in second language proficiency, we expect them to lead to differences and changes in the characteristics of the essays that the students write, which will be reflected in differences and changes in essay scores. So when I talk about differences, that means it's a cross-sectional. So if we have students with different levels of proficiency at any point in time, that's what we call differences. And change refers to change over time. So as students' proficiency develops over time, then that's what we're looking at, and then we expect that their characteristics of their essays will also change. So for example, maybe they will write longer essays that are more accurate with fewer errors and more coherent and so on, and that will be reflected in their essay scores. So this is the model we've been using in these studies, and one can add other factors to before or after this model, I guess. So one of the factors one can add here is that maybe second language instruction is somewhere here that leads to differences and changes in second language proficiency, which leads to these changes and so on. So I'm going to talk about the first study, which is the one we did on the Pearson test of English academic writing scores. And so in that study, we had 1,000 test takers who each took PTE academic 3 to 15 times. Most of them, actually, all 1,000 students took the test at least 3 times. About 500 took it around 4 times. And then I think there is only 3 or 4 students who took actually the test 13 to 15 times. So you can see, and all of this happened in 1 year, right? And we looked at sources of variability or in scores over time, as well as cross-sectionally across learners. And so we include what we call a construct relevant factor, which is English proficiency. And we did not have any measure external to the test of English language proficiency. So what we did was we computed a composite score. So composite score was consists of the scores of the student on the reading, speaking, and listening sections. So we basically averaged those and used it as a proxy for English language proficiency at any point in time in the study. Then we also looked at the retesting effects to see if there is any effects for practice. So basically we used two measures for that. This is the number of tests taken. So for the student who took the test 15 times, they had number of tests, more tests taken than a student who just took the test 3 times. And so we compared those. And then the period between tests, meaning how much time between any 2 tests taken, and that's also a measure of retesting effects to see that. And then we also included several test taker variables and context factors, including the first language, gender, age, context of the test, and that's basically the country where the test was taken, and we divide that into 3 groups. If you're familiar with this distinction between inner, outer, and expanding circles, depending on whether English is used as a major language or you only used in the classroom, I guess, in the outer, in the expanding circle. And then the last factor is the reason for taking the test, and this is basically whether they're taking the test for a job or for study. And we used multi-level modeling to examine shape and rate of change in writing scores and the contribution of these different factors to the change in test scores over time. So I'm just going to give an overview of some of the key findings. The first one is that changes in writing score followed a quadratic trajectory, means they were not linear. They basically increased for the first 5 months and then started to diminish or decline over time. The rate of change in writing scores varied significantly across test takers, meaning they had, remember those lines I showed you? So different students have different lines in terms of they're going up and down, and I guess the rate of change as well as the shape to some extent. And this depended on their initial English proficiency. So test takers who started with high English language proficiency based on their composite scores, they had a higher rate of change in writing scores over time. So they experienced a faster rate of change compared to the ones who started with low proficiency. Then the changes in writing scores over time were significantly associated with changes in test takers' overall English language proficiency, meaning those who had higher rate of change in their overall English proficiency as measured by their composite scores tend to have a high rate of change in their writing scores. But the retesting or practice with the test actually did not have a significant effects on changes in writing scores. And this, I mean, from a validity point of view, is a good thing. Basically, we want scores on writing to change as a function of a change in overall English proficiency, but not due to other factors such as practice with the test itself. Okay. The strongest predictor of the differences in scores and changes in scores was the test taker initial overall English language proficiency. That's again a good thing in this context. As I said, the retesting did not affect writing scores or rate of change. And other factors contributed significantly to variability between test takers at test occasion 1. But not to the rate of change. So I think test takers in the inner circle tend to have higher scores of writing on test occasion 1. And test taker age and first language also were associated with differences in writing scores, but they were not associated with the change or the rate of change in writing scores over time. And then the second study where we looked at the responses to the IELTS writing task 2. And in this study, we wanted to examine changes in the linguistic characteristics of the written responses of test takers. This is similar to many previous studies who actually look at the characteristics of the written or spoken performance or test takers, but most, if not all, previous studies were all cross-sectional, in the sense they usually take, for example, with the IELTS, they'll take essays written that received scores of, say, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 on the IELTS rubric, and then they compare them at one point in time. But in this study, what we want to do is to look at change over time. And so we still looked at the cross-sectional question of what's the differences between essays at different score levels at each time point. But we're more interested in the longitudinal questions, which include how the linguistic characteristics change across test occasions, how initial L2 writing ability relate to changes in essay characteristics, and how the characteristics of repeaters' essay relate to their writing scores across test occasions. So those are I think, the more important questions in this study. So for this, we got a small sample, 234 essays on task 2 of IELTS. They were written by 78 test takers who each took the IELTS 3 times, right? The 78 test takers, actually, we selected them purposefully so they have 3 levels of initial writing ability. So based on their writing scores at test 1, we have a group who received score of 4, another group received 5, and then 6 and 20, about 26 at each level. Okay. Now, one of the things about this study, and I think it's one of the challenges about research, is this data set was selected by IELTS, and they purposefully selected students who, or test takers who improved. So they did not include test takers who had, for example, stayed at the same level or their scores declined over time. And so the writing scores for this sample increased significantly by about 0.63 points on average across test occasions, suggesting that overall essay quality improved over time. So the question was, if scores change significantly, what writing features explain these changes, right? So why did these the essays of these 78 test takers received higher scores on subsequent test occasions? And that's the key question, I guess, that IELTS were interested in. And so what we did was to analyze these essays in terms of various linguistic features, including fluency, number of words, basically, accuracy, number of errors per 100 words. We looked at syntactic and lexical complexity, cohesion, text organization, register, and meta discourse using various computer programs. And then we compared those linguistic features across the 3 groups, and as well as the 3 test occasions. And then we also looked at the relationship between writing features and essay scores across test occasions. So some of the findings. The first set of findings concerns the changes in writing features. One of the things I think this study contributes is that provides an initial description of changes in writing features across test occasions. I don't think any study has done that before. As I said, most studies that just do this cross-sectionally and then make claims that are longitudinal in nature. So some of the key findings are some aspects of writing, like the length and ratio of errors, number of passive constructions, changed significantly over time, while others did not, right? Essays tend to become significantly longer, more linguistically accurate, that's fewer errors, have high conceptual cohesion, include more formal features, and fewer interaction meta-discourse markers over time. The rate of change in several features varied significantly across test takers, but only rate of change in conceptual cohesion was significantly moderated by initial second language writing ability. Let me show you some examples. So for fluency, for example, it actually changed significantly across test occasion. So there was a significant increase in length over time, right? But this change in length actually varied significantly across test takers. Differences in length across test takers decreased over time. So so if you remember, there are three groups, level 3, 4, and 5. Level 3 is the one that actually witnessed the greatest increase in length, while level 5, for example, had the lowest increase in length over time. Right? But initial second language writing ability did not actually explain that difference. What happened, I think, is that trying to show you this visually. So they started having larger difference in terms of essay length, and over time they become similar. And I think the main reason for that is that given that these tests are written within a specific amount of time, there is only so much that they can, they cannot write more within the 30 minutes, I think. And so at some point, I mean, there's no, the increase in length is gonna plateau or stop. In terms of accuracy, there was a significant decrease or decline in number of errors over time. So fewer errors, but this did not vary across across learners. In terms of cohesion, there was a significant increase in conceptual cohesion. This conceptual cohesion varied significantly across learners. And one of the reason for that is that their initial L2 ability was different. So test takers with lower initial writing scores had a higher rate of change in their conceptual cohesion compared to test takers with higher initial scores. And then an example of a feature that did not change at all was complexity. Both syntactic and lexical complexity did not change actually significantly across the three test occasions. In terms of the relationship between essay features and scores, it did not vary significantly across test occasions, meaning that in general, the same features that explain differences in scores on test occasion 1 were the same ones that explained variability in scores test occasion 2 and 3, which is a good thing, meaning that the criteria actually used for evaluating the essays stayed the same cross test occasion. The only difference was for essay length, right? And so the relationship between essay length and scores became weaker over time. So it has a less explanatory power in terms of explaining the differences in scores. And then you can see longer essays with higher lexical sophistication and diversity, higher syntactic complexity, and fewer contractions tend to obtain higher scores. So some of the implications, I just have 2 more slides to go through. The studies, of course, have their limitations, but those limitations, like, for example, the sample size, the data available, like, for example, for the Pearson test study, we did not have data about what kind of instruction the test takers received between the tests and how much time or how often they did the test preparation and so on. So that data was not available. And some of these variables, as I said, the selection, for example, for the essays for the IELTS study were determined by IELTS, and so we're not able to include essays or test takers who had lower scores on later test occasion. But these limitations, for me, I see them as some of the key challenges in doing this kind of research, that you may not be able to obtain all variables that theory and research shows that are relevant to the focus, or for practical reasons or other test security reasons, they may not be able to access that data. But I think this research can expand our understanding of variability in test performance and second language development over time. And in this context, both studies were about second language writing. And so some of the findings actually give us a better, hopefully, understanding of the rate and shape of change in second language writing performance over time, and some of the contextual factors that affect them. It also tells us something about what aspects of writing change, when do they change, how much time they need to see a change, and which features do not change over time. So as I mentioned earlier, I mean, syntactic complexity, for example, with the IELTS sample, we did not see any significant change in that, but for some other features we saw some significant change. And this tells us also which measures maybe are sensitive to change and instruction. So which aspects of writing or measures we use in our studies are able to detect some of the changes. And so, for example, I think some measures are better than others in detecting change, and that maybe it's in a sense a circular argument by saying that some measures can detect change, and that tells us that some aspects of writing are able to change and others don't. And so these 2 points, I think, require further research to be able to separate the two and be able to make any claims about each one of them separately. And then which aspects of writing contribute or are reflected in scores, and to what extent, and changes in scores. And that's another thing that we should be able to make claims about based on this kind of research, as I mentioned, which is to say, if we observe changes in score, or writing scores in this case, then which aspects of writing contribute to that change? And then finally, this kind of research can contribute to validation research on second language tests and the use of second language test scores, of course. So future directions and some challenges. I think we need more studies to describe and explain changes in repeaters' test performance and second language development in general. And for that, we need certainly more longitudinal research. We also, I think, need more research to examine and improve the sensitivity of second language tests in terms of tasks, the rating scales, or raters to change in second language ability over time and second language instruction. And so if we want to use tests to actually assess second language development or change as a result of instruction, then we need to do more research on to what extent these tests are sensitive to those changes, and if they're not, how can we improve them to make them more sensitive so they can detect those changes. And this kind of research can face several challenges. As I said, this will require longitudinal kind of research that not only addresses the quality of the characteristics of the test itself, but how to design a study and how to analyze scores. We also need to collect additional data, either demographic or information about the second language study that the test takers undertake before and between tests, and any kind of preparation or practice they do. And we need to use more advanced, as I said, statistical analysis tools, as well as qualitative, actually longitudinal kind of analysis to understand these things. But I think this kind of research can be very rewarding because it can actually shed more light on and improve the validity of second language tests, as well as help us improve and maybe build better theories of second language development over time. So yeah, so that's the end of the presentation. I think I'm doing okay with time?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Okay. So now we can have some questions and welcome your comments to feedback.
Thank you very much for the great comment.
I have a question. Could we go back to page 16? 16.
Tell me when you see page 6. Okay, yeah, the number. Okay.
So I was wondering, participants here took the test 3 to 15 times in a year.
Yeah.
So how was the time term entered into the model? And hence, I guess also the quadratic term, right?
Sorry, say that again.
So how was the time term entered into the model?
Okay.
Is it 15 equal space, or how was it?
No, actually, I used time as a continuous variable, starting from 0 at test 1, and then number of weeks from test 1. So it was not the number of times, right? Because that actually was the number of tests taken. Here, time was entered as a continuous variable with number of weeks from test 1.
I also have a question about this. So you said you use multi-level modeling. So did you get faster for the number of tests taken? Like, did you cluster students according to how many times they've taken the test?
No, again, I use that as a continuous variable from zero before test 1, right, to 14 before test 15.
Because I feel those people who actually took this test for 15 times should be a different population from those who took the test for
Yeah. That's a good point, and I struggled with these. I mean, the two questions you asked about the time and the number of tests, actually, the most challenging ones in defining and using these variables, because as I said, I mean, how you define time, it's an important question. It can affect the analysis, and one can think, as I said, of time as how many times from 1 to 15, but then that will be the same as the number of tests taken, and so I decided to use time as the length between the first test. And mind you, the first test in this data set, because I don't know actually whether those test takers took the test before what's called the first time in this study, right? And so some of them maybe took the test before that, but Pearson just gave me the data for that 1 year, for that one period. Yeah, so that's and so the reasoning for the time in terms of number of weeks was actually to get a sense of how much time between the tests, right? And the assumption, I guess, that I made was to say that the longer the time, the more opportunities those students had to, those test takers had perhaps to practice or study English, right? And so that's the, I guess, the assumption I made, and that's how I defined it as number of days. But yeah, I mean, one can group these participants in different ways and look at that too. Yeah, that's a possibility. Yeah.
Not measurements. Hi, I also have a question on this slide. You might have mentioned it, I might have missed it. So I'm not very familiar with the Pearson writing test, but I guess they will receive a prompt and they will have 15 to 20 minutes to write about it. So for the participants who actually took this for 3 to 15 times, were they given the same prompt, or did the topic vary?
No, they it's like all other tests. They give them a equivalent task, and it's not identical, but they're basically assumed to measure the same thing. And yeah. Okay. And so, and that's, again, is not modeled in this study, and that could be a factor. I mean, the assumption with these tests, and that's, again, is when you administer the test to different students at the same time, or the same students over time, they usually give them different forms of the test. And so I'm assuming, and they had some discussion about this with Pearson, and they confirmed that they actually do research to confirm the equivalence of the forms, right? So making sure that all the writing tasks are of the same difficulty and the same genre and so on. But yeah, we don't know. That's actually an issue with the IELTS study, where we analyzed the essays, and it seems in some cases that based on reading the essays themselves, some of the differences in the features are due to the specific topic they received, right? So you can have all the essays about making an argument, but you're making an argument about different topics, and that will have implications for the vocabulary, for example, you use, right? And so that should be modeled too in this analysis, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess the practice effect, the effect of practice will vary a lot depending on whether you receive the same prompt or a different prompt. And is there like a study that actually looked into that?
I don't think so. No, I don't know of any. Yeah, but that's yeah, I agree. That's a good question to ask and to try to address. Yeah.
So hello. I met you not virtually, on email. I was writing about a chapter on the rubric development with Charlene lately. The book that you're co-editing for Alista Crumming, the professor.
Okay. Yeah.
Hello. So when we talked about the IELTS studies, and then I realized that the chart that you described on, I think, page 23 is something the slide has something different from my understanding. So I just wanted to ask.
This one, right?
Yeah. So as far as I know regarding accuracy, I don't think I saw many studies that observed changes in accuracy over time. Repeated designs. I was wondering if in this slide, the yes for the change across test occasion here, how did you measure accuracy? I was wondering about that.
Yeah, so yeah, sure. So for this study, we used computer programs to analyze the essays and all features. So there's no human coding or rating involved. And so for accuracy, we used the criterion. This is a
ETS tool?
Criterion, yeah, ETS criterion. Basically, we counted the number of errors and then divided them by the number of the words and multiplied by 100. So basically, the measure is number of errors per 100 words. That's what we use.
So those errors were like morphological errors, or do you know how that?
Yeah, so criterion has 5 kinds of errors that they measure. Hold on, I'm gonna try to get that. There is the grammatical ones, grammar. There is a mechanics. There is a style. There is usage, and they have specific categories like verb, subject, agreement.
Yeah, I see. Maybe that's why.
Because they were.
I think this is different from the previous studies that looked at participants in connection. Okay. So yeah, maybe that's why I don't think this finding is a little bit different from previous studies that required hand-coded counts. So I did a study with Charlene on looking at why accuracy never changes over time over the semester. Here we found that we find developments in terms of complexity and fluency, but we always find difficulties in capturing accuracy changes. So I was wondering how you found this. So
well, no. Yeah, no, that we did not find any changes in complexity and
Oh.
Yeah.
That's as you mentioned, it's really relevant to the topic or genre of writing, I guess. So maybe something that you couldn't really have control over.
Yeah, the other thing, I guess you mentioned that you did this study before and after a period of instruction, right?
Yes.
A term or something. In our study, I don't know if you noted this. I'm going to go back to this slide, but you can see here the length of time between the tests. So for some test takers in this sample, actually, they took they took a test every week. So the first day they took the test 1.
They were desperate.
They took test 2, and 1 week later took test 3. For some of them, actually, the time between test 1 and 3 is 219 days, right? And so that's another factor too. It's the length of time between the tests. And, as I said, I don't know what kind of things these test takers engaged in doing between the tests. I don't think, for example, for test takers who did 3 tests in 2 weeks, they engaged any meaningful study. But maybe those who did like 7 months here, they did some meaningful study. So that's another factor too that can explain the differences. But you're right. I mean, the way this is measured also make a difference. We opted for, I guess, more efficient approach to coding errors accuracy, and that's through the computer program. But criterion, as I'm sure you know, has its limitations in terms of its ability to detect errors and what kind of errors it addresses. Yeah, so that's another.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one more question, and I think it's a bit general. And so you mentioned that so almost none of the tasks except for progress developed by Pearson is targeted at progress over time for test takers. So how would you design a test to measure progress? And how would that be different if you design a test like TOEFL or IELTS just to measure test takers' performance at a certain point of time? How would you design the test differently? And why would you do that to make sure it's sensitive to progress? Because I feel if it's a proficiency test, then what we care about is just proficiency at a certain point of time. Then we don't care about progress. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the study we're looking at in terms of progress is to, mind you, I mean, I have to give you a brief description of progress. So progress is a test that has, I think, 6 or 7 levels of proficiency. So students at different levels would take different form of or versions of or levels of the test. And then the test is administered 3 times. So that's the other dimension to it. It's designed in a way that it is administered at 3 points in time. It's not at just 1 point in time. And then the progress or inferences about change in proficiency are based on those 3 times, not on 1 point in time, right?
Yeah.
And so that's in terms of the design and the analysis. But in terms of the other third dimension, as I mentioned, which is the measurement, right? I don't think there is any kind of research actually on whether when it detects change, it actually detects real change, and whether it's the fact that students get different forms of the same test over 3 points in time, does that lead to measurement variance or not? And to what extent it's sensitive to change. So those are the questions, some of the question. I think the key question that we're addressing in our current study is its sensitivity to change. Can it actually detect change in proficiency, right?
Okay.
But in general, I mean, if you look at the, I don't know if this is available to the public, but I have access to some of the reports on progress. The way it is designed and described, it's very similar to other traditional proficiency tests. Yeah, so there's no discussion in the research reports or the technical reports on the design of the test on how it can or why they think it can actually detect change. Right?
It's just the way it's designed, because it's like it has 3 sets in the test. I guess one set.
Yeah. That's the claim. It's that it is a measure of proficiency. So basically, like any other test, except that it is administered 3 times at the beginning, middle, and end of a program of English language instruction. And so the claim about that it is detecting change is based on that, not actually on any property of the test itself.
Okay.
And so one of the questions we're trying to address in the study we're currently doing is what I did. That's actually, it is sensitive to change.
Okay.
Yeah. But those, as I said, those measurement issues of validity threats to measurement of or detection of change or development are, I think, some of the factors that one need to consider when designing a test that is intended to measure development. And as I said, that's a work in progress. So I'm still trying to, or thinking about this, and how the next question, which is your question, is how do we apply those principles or ideas to develop an assessment that can actually detect change.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So it's a work in progress, I guess.
Okay, we're just looking forward to a paper then.
Professor, is the IELTS paper on the linguistic features, is that available now? Is it also a working process?
No, it is. It's published actually. Sorry, I can send you the references or even the whole slide. Hold on.
Sure.
Sorry.
I guess if there are no more questions, we're going to wrap it up. Thank
you.
So,
so this is the paper. This is the this is the paper, the study on IELTS. It's published as an IELTS research report.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah. And the other one on on the Pearson, it's just published actually in Language Testing 2019.
Could you also share your slides with us? So
yeah, sure. Yeah, I can email you the slides. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
There's some good questions and discussion for me to think about too.
Yeah, I feel it's too short. I wish we had like 2 hours for this.
Yeah.
So many questions. Okay. All right.
If you have, I guess if you want, I will send the slides, and if people have questions or thoughts, you can give them my email.
Okay, that would be great. Okay. Yeah, I'll let them know. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you again for inviting me, and have a nice weekend.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay, how do I log out of this thing?
Okay, I'll just end.